for years, you know how you don't give money to
Oh,
different ones,
yeah,
and they'll send you at least 4 cards.
yeah.
The most beautiful cards. And I looked at them, I said, something tells me that people don't send cards anymore. And, but I do, so I'll bring you a whole bunch next time. All kinds of cards.
I have a whole bunch of
You have a whole
stuff.
bunch.
Yeah,
They're every kind, Christmas from
yeah,
Easter,
yeah, yeah.
and they're
We
beautiful.
We get such pretty ones from, the Navigators.
Yes, I do too, I just got some from them, yes.
This year, for several years, I kept all the Christmas cards that I got from the Navigators. This year,
Oh, no,
I had, you know, not that my stack's that big anymore. Every time I get ready to do that, I'm just brokenhearted at how many names I have to cross off the list because they've gone on to be
Yeah.
the Lord.
no.
So sad.
I know what you mean.
But you know, my children, don't live here.
Yeah, Kentucky.
Yeah, and then we have several, well, our son's in Michigan and our daughter's in Kentucky. And our one grandson's in Alaska. And anyway, and then we have several friends that are our age that have lost spouses that have been, you know, really close to us all through the years. And I try to send them a card, for every special occasion. And of course, my grandkids are almost too old now, although they say they're going to get too old. But, you know, I send them something for everything. And of course, there's something special roughly every month. Send them something for it, and then their birthdays, you know. And, so,
Okay.
What did you ask your daughter, did she darkest?
you know what, I did not, I forgot. She is in such a state of just brain drain when she gets home that, sometimes I don't even think to ask her.
Yeah.
Like today, she's been
busy.
staying, she's been staying late to work
Yeah.
on Thursdays because she knows we come to class. And I asked her yesterday because she was held up late in a meeting yesterday and didn't get to go to corral practice because of it. She was not a happy camper with that. So no, I did not go.
For a reason, was muted again. And I don't know what this is doing up there. But that's okay. All right, let's dive in we're going to talk about the wonderful end result we have with all of these manuscripts and the consequence mainly of just having so many. Let me get the right thing up here. You should have gotten one like this, causes and kinds. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on the details because all of this stuff is technical. We talked about the fact that we have 5,000 plus manuscripts. I can get this bigger, can't I? Let's see, I can even do it like this. Now that I think about it. And if you counted every manuscript and every difference in every manuscript, then you end up with 100,000 or whatever their current number is. Every manuscript with every difference in spelling, pronoun, preposition, word order, all that kind of stuff. We're going to look at this discipline of textual criticism, which studies these documents with the purpose of trying to evaluate all these variations and come up with an idea of what might have been the original. But even that may not be a precise thing. Is it possible that Mark or Luke wrote more than one draft? John is told to write 7 letters to 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3. Did he write just that paragraph in chapter 2 or 3 to them? Or would he not have written them the whole book? And so there would have been 7 copies initially. No chance that John or his transcribed editor or whoever he might have had doing the actual writing for him didn't write a slightly different spelling of a word, use a slightly different but synonymous preposition. So we may not have an original copy. And then we have that interesting thing we saw about Ephesians in Ephesians 1:1, and then Colossians mentioning a Laodicean letter, which some people think Ephesians is really this Laodicean letter, so we don't have a piece of Pauline writing out there somewhere that hadn't been discovered yet. Well, was there more than one copy of that initially? Okay, so we have all kinds of variations, and they like to distinguish these by those that they think are unintentional and those that they think are intentional. Well, some of those would depend on how well this person was reading this. You can't make intentional changes in grammar or spelling if you don't know what you're doing at all. But even then, was this a change deliberate or was it unintentional, unconscious? Remember the uncials, letter by letter by letter, no word separation? You ever tried to read that? You can if you have some idea about what the text is, but if you have no idea what the text is, trying to read that's a little interesting. And you have all kinds of similarities of sounds, the letters, and these crop up in all kinds of manuscripts. And here's a couple of examples where this OS, depending on how it's accented, it can be who, the relative pronoun who, or it can be the pronoun us, or it could even be an abbreviation of God, which in fact, some translators took it that way. And so you have God was manifest, or simply he was manifest. By common confession, great is the mystery of godliness, who was revealed. They read it as who. The word our and yours, the difference is one little vowel. Is it hemon or humon? And we have passages in the Bible where actual translators have chosen differently, and so the translation comes out different because they chose a different manuscript to follow. You get a slight change in the letter. Here you have Elabon as Ebelon. You have all kinds of repetitions and similarities. We have some text where this passage in John loses a phrase simply because the phrases sound the same. And I'm show you in just a minute another person's list of these things so you see some of the same kind of things. In intentional ones, you've got this whole issue of grammar. You're declining all your nouns and adjectives. You're conjugating all your verbs. Style changes. And so a copyist who knew Greek could be reading this and either intentionally or unconsciously modify the conjugation or the declining of a noun because he's corrected it. It's not the way he thinks it ought to be, the way he knows Greek, and so he changes it. Well, now, you can't always, how do you know whether he did that intentionally or unconsciously? A pretty obvious one is this passage in Mark 1:2, where the writer apparently wrote, even as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before my face, who shall prepare your way. Well, the quote's from Malachi. So a copyist copying this knows the Bible, and he knows that's not in Isaiah, that's from Malachi. And so he modifies this to simply say, in the prophets, it says. Because it's not in Isaiah, except if you've accepted the existence of the Hebrew collections. Isaiah could have been the first book in the prophets. And so the collection of the prophets is called Isaiah. And the fact that Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea, Joel, Amos, Jonah are all in that collection, he calls it by how they designated this collection, Isaiah. Then you have the issue of one like this. The text seems to read originally, there is therefore now no condemnation to those that are in Christ Jesus. Well, now that's a pretty bold statement. Maybe that ought to be qualified a little bit. And so we say, those who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Now, it just so happens that that phrase also occurs later on. So the question is, was this a deliberate intention to narrow this wonderful claim, or was this an unconscious thing? You have all kinds of fun with prepositions that mean sometimes the same thing. And this is even more true because they had prepositions with wide ranges of meaning. And so they would overlap. You could even have three pronouns that if you put all the ways they were used in a circle, you could put the three circles together, and there was a place where all three pronouns got used with some of the same meaning, but they had all kinds of meanings off to the side of each of them. Well, if you had a passage where this was fairly commonly said, and there again, you see how well do you know this language? And so you recognize that this pronoun's a little strange here. It may be appropriate, but possible, but it's not the common way they say this. But if you didn't, you know, it would just go right by you. The whole issue of parallel passages, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're writing it from in one, how easy it is for you to remember how it's said in one of the others. And so you write the other one, not the one you just read. Additions like the one that's pretty well recognized in the passage where there's this gathering of the sick, the blind, and the withered at the pool. And there are some old manuscripts that have this whole verse in, the angel went down at certain times in the pool. We'll see that when we look at this later on. And this very, very common one in the Lord's Prayer. There are manuscripts that don't have that last phrase, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. That's clearly a liturgical element that one would expect to find, so we're not surprised that it's there. Okay, let me show you a similar thing. Causes. And here you get some of the same kind of thing. Unintentional changes, faulty eyesight, or careless inspection of the original based on the familiarity of the words, likeness of pronunciation. And then you have this suggestion here that the possibility that some of these places where we have extensions like the one, the angel came down to the pool, these may be the incorporation of a marginal note. And somebody actually wrote that on a manuscript. Well, the next guy came along to copy the manuscript, and he thought, well, maybe he missed that, and so he wrote it out here in the column, so we'd know it's there, and so he puts it in. Let me blow this one up for you. There we go. And here you have some more examples of the same kind of thing. Here's that elabon and that ebelon, which is simply a matter of receive or strike. That occurs in a passage about they're beating on Jesus. The marginal notes.
Good reach, probably.
Here's this Isaiah the prophet again mentioned here. And the text that where Luke 2:23 simply has his father, and some texts have the name, Joseph, just so you assure you. And then there's even this one where you have these additions of fasting. And we'll see that when we look at it. So you have all of these possibilities of various things, like we mentioned last week, where you would go from the line that read at the beginning and the end. There's a passage where the manuscripts clearly do that. And in one case, they miss the area, and the other manuscript, they double. It's the same paragraph. It's the same sentence, and this copyist missed the in-between time. He jumped from the first one to the second one, and the other manuscript went back to the first one the second time. You have the same kind of thing. What you end up with, yes, question? Oh, coming in. There's a stack of papers up here, I thought, that you can take. You got them in your email, but you can have them tonight if you want to write on them. Nobody else joined us there. Let's see if, yeah, no, just that one over there. That one's for her, in case she came in.
Oh, this was mine.
We're on page.
Okay.
The second page causes textual variations.
We're getting ready to go to this page you don't have, because there wasn't any reason particularly to give it to you. This shows you a page out of a Greek New Testament. And this is the text at the top of the page. This is from Romans. And that's all the text you have on the page. All the rest of the page are the passages where there are alternative variants. But these are variants of what? Or and what? So that's what you can end up with when you try to compile the information from all the various manuscripts. You can have on one single page of New Testament text all of these variants. In 24, there's 2. In 26, there's 1. And in 28, there's 1. Now, see, this takes up so much space because the editor is listing with each of these changes all of the major manuscripts that support that reading. So this is a text that is used by people who are trying to do semi-independent translation of the text. And you want to give them a clear picture of what's really out there as options. But nobody's going to use this except very, very specialized scholars. There's no reason, because when you look at these, you're looking at the spelling of the word. Is the and there or not? Does it come before or after the word? And those kind of things. And the reason why this looks like so much, you see, is that there's all these manuscripts that support this strange reading. Now, lest you worry about it, I gave you 2 documents. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. Well, now where'd my share go? Holdings on New Testament variants. This one that looks like this has JP Holding at the beginning. And this talks about the numbers, the kinds, the varieties of all of these changes as assessed, as valued by various scholars to show why they're not concerned when they find all of these differences. This little chart here is interesting. The book of Matthew, 60% of the verses in the book of Matthew have no variation. There aren't any variants for 60% of the verses. Down here in Galatians, it's 76. So there's much of the material, there just isn't anything. And in that material that there is, it's all minor technicalities. The name is spelled differently. There's an AE instead of just the A or the E. Remember, they declined even their names because it's a noun. And so whether he's the subject of the sentence or the object of the sentence, the spelling's going to be different. For us in English, that would, it'd be the same both places. For them, it would be different. But here's a place where somebody just puts the wrong form in the place because that's a meaningless thing to them, like it would be to us. And so you get a difference. Yeah. Yeah, same kind of thing. Yeah. And here's this final statement. In matters of Christian faith, there is no variant reading. Not a single solitary teaching or practice, with the exception of that fasting issue, is ever affected by a variant reading. And even on those passages, as one we're going to see, where there is a important idea being expressed, that's not the only place it's in the Bible. So whether it's there or not is not necessary, not material. If you lose it, you don't lose anything. No doctrine of Christianity is in the least dependent on any textual variant. Nothing matters except the precise meaning of this verse in this context. Is it future or subjunctive? Is it one person or another person? Was it Bethany or Bethsaida that this took place? That kind of stuff. That's what you have. Then I gave you another one of this same nature. That one was by Holding. And I gave you one by Bentley, I think it was. Textual Variations, that's this one, I believe, yes. 5,000 manuscripts. Here's all the material. Bound to have differences. This fellow suggests up to 200,000 variations if you start counting every one in every text. But then he has the scholars who boil this down and show you which ones are really material and really mean anything. And you have several of those. And he has both the Old and the New Testament here. And you can look at these at your leisure, go back to them. Okay.
Okay, Dad needs some page with that too.
Yes. Now, as a result of that, then, yeah, there's several that don't have headings on them. Okay. Yeah, that's the one I just looked at, I think. Variations.
Oh, okay.
Starts out with how many manuscripts and papyri and all that kind of stuff. So that leads us to the discipline of trying to sort through all of that. And that's the discipline of textual criticism, textual judgment. This is not criticism in terms of criticizing but criticism in terms of judging, evaluating. And I give you a little history here of how this occurred in the New Testament. History of New Testament criticism.
And somebody's having more fun in this neighborhood than you are.
Sounds like a name.
And it begins in 1516. Erasmus beats several guys to the printing press first, so he gets the credit of producing the first printed copy of the New Testament. And he had 5 or 6 manuscripts to look at. One of them is the one that's considered to lie behind the King James Version. But a great deal of scholarship has been spent by several different groups of people trying to match a manuscript to the King James translation, and they can't do it. There's every evidence that the King James translators did the same thing every translator has done, and that is pick and choose on certain verses which manuscript they were going to follow. And the reality is that in some of these early translations, their choice was not even a Greek manuscript, it was the Latin that they chose as the reading. Yes.
Is any of this in any way, does it take away from the authenticity of the document, or is it just a curious thing to explore?
If you were comparing that particular piece to what you judged as a more authentic version, then yes, there's difference. But the reality is that all of our results from this first one on has been a matter of somebody or a group of men subjectively choosing at various places which version, which manuscript they were going to follow. So you can't say their process, quote, took away from the authenticity of the text, because we don't know what the authentic text was. So what we end up with when we make our choices where there are differences, and we say, okay, this is our best guess of what the New Testament was written to say. That's simply our best scholarly effort. And not every scholar is going to agree with it on every verse. He's going to have his objections, at least on some verses, that he just doesn't think we made the right choice. So nobody ends up taking away from, because we don't have anything to take from. We don't know what that was. The reverse is the major issue, and that is there is no way that you can put a, quote, better, more authentic, more accurate title to certainly any of the current scholarly products, of which there are about 6 different ones. You could make that judgment against some of these older efforts, mainly because they simply had so few manuscripts to choose from. But even as there's nobody who can make the claim of their English translation, that this is the most accurate, the most readable, the best, the most sure, the best reading. You can't do that with any English translation. You may say that on any given verse, that this, in your view, in your understanding, makes the best sense, is the best way to translate that. But you can't press that on any total Bible, because there's just nobody that's done that. Everybody that writes a version, writes a document to defend, to promote one of these translations and makes these claims, within weeks, somebody can come along and show them a dozen places where that translation fouls it up in their view, and a dozen places where somebody else does something better than they did in other places. And the same is true with a manuscript. An eclectic manuscript where you try to choose what you think are the best of all the alternatives. You simply can do that. Angie?
So just as an example, you know, there have been certain people or whatever that sometimes they'll say, well, I prefer the KJV version.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of those. We're just gonna choose that one just because we know it happens a lot. Is it because maybe like that particular version had less criticism, or is there an actual reason? Or do I have to ask every individual, like, why do you prefer that one?
Only with the King James, there's been some effort to promote this new English Standard Version very, very strongly the same way. There are a number of people who are firmly committed to the proposition that the King James is the best translation, and its manuscript is the best manuscript. But as I just pointed out, the scholars haven't been able to find that manuscript. The translators didn't report a manuscript that they relied on all the time. And when the translator, when these scholars go through and check every single verse against any manuscript, they have not been able to find a manuscript that would yield the translation in every single place that the translators made it. And in some cases, it's not just a matter of a translations. It's like some of these choices of the name of the place, the name of the person, the character of the verb. Was it future or present? Or was it, what mood was it in and what number did it have? Where there are clear differences. And so you can't say this was just a translation choice. The translation betrays the text they were reading. And this one manuscript that's traditionally been accepted works in a whole lot of cases, but it doesn't work every case. And so those scholars who have studied this most closely just absolutely insist that the King James translators show that they're like every other translator. And they made choices on some verses. And in some cases, it's clear that the choice they made was the Latin, not the Greek at all. They stayed with a traditional translation of the several earlier translations, some of which were based on the Latin. They didn't even try to translate the Greek. They just translated the Latin text into Greek. And I list these just so you can see the historical progression. These two here are the ones that you frequently find referred to as the received text, or in Latin, the textus receptus. But neither one of these printings were much more widely used than some of the others. And certainly they were displaced very early by this new wave of manuscript guys, Tischendorf, Westcott, and Hort, and then later. Nestle was another scholar. And there is a publishing company, still has a group of scholars that work on his text. So there's the Nestle text, there's the Westcott and Horst text. There's this modern one done by the United Bible Societies, which is a common, because they sold it so cheaply. A lot of preachers have this as their Greek New Testament, whether or not they can really use it well or not. And it was built for Bible translators in worldwide languages. And so they do a great deal differently in order to try to help the translators understand the issues that are involved where these differences occur. The work of these guys resulted in comparing this massive number of texts, especially where you had large number of texts or the whole text. And by looking at how the differences that they have, and they have similar differences, or in some cases identical differences, then it's pretty easy to tell if this is the text where the guy jumped the paragraph, went from the first time the line appeared, and then jumped down to the next line and skipped in between. If you've got a bunch of manuscripts that do the same thing as that, then you can say, oh, they're related. Now, they may not be copied from his, and you don't know which one was first, but they all have the same, quote, mistake or the same change. And you're talking about 27 books, you're talking about a whole lot of material, and most of these changes you see aren't consistent all the way through a manuscript. And so this is nitpicking technical stuff for them to come up with this classification where they group most of these manuscripts in 3 or 4 groups. And they say, oh, this is a Byzantine manuscript. This is an Alexandrian manuscript. Well, some cases it fits, some cases it doesn't. And so then you end up with a whole bunch of unclassified. The guys, especially the man and the woman who worked on this text of the American Bible, the United Bible Societies, came up with the Alans, or their name, they came up with a new classification for their people, because there's so many cases where when you get down to a particular passage, these earlier classifications don't fit. So they tried to come up with a new set of classifications, which they use then in that apparatus that they created, that I showed you the picture of. And they aren't the same. They somewhat fit in, but not all the manuscripts that they put in this fit in the category as it was categorized by other people. And I just put all this in here so you can see that this is not any settled thing. There's not anywhere near unanimity as to how this goes together. And then once you've decided on a group of manuscripts that you think may be the best, and so you're going to choose them more times than others on most verses, well, what principles do you use? And I just give you some stuff here based on the external evidence. There are people who are going to say, well, the older manuscript would be better. Well, maybe not. Maybe this older manuscript was a real bad manuscript. It got created by somebody who didn't know what he was writing, and he missed a whole lot of letters, and who knows, It's older, but that doesn't necessarily prove anything. Now, for the vast majority of scholars today, these 3 great old manuscripts, the Vatican, the Sinaiticus, and the Alexandrian, are considered the primary evidence. But people who promote the King James Version, for instance, say those are all modified texts. They may be the oldest, but they were already modified. And the mistakes that are there are already there. So you can't solve everybody. Based on the internal evidence, there are all kinds of arguments. Well, the easiest reading might be the wrong reading. See, it would not stand to reason that the copyist would make this harder, but that he would make it easier makes sense. The longer version would tend to indicate that this is really somebody's addition. Well, maybe what was shorter had something else out. So how do you prove that? So now you see you're subjectively dealing with how you understand the text, what you think this writer is trying to say, and which one of these alternatives fits best. We're down in the subjectivity all over the place. And when you look at the end result, what they decided doesn't fit any of the rules. They decided anyway. They decided against some of the rules based on some decision. It's greatly subjective. And so I give you this quote at the end. Emmanuel Tove is a great, famous Old Testament scholar. Textual evaluation is an art in the full sense of the word. It's the bottom of this one on New Testament criticism, textual criticism. It's the bottom of the page. This was 4 pages, so there was 2 pages
I see it.
to this.
Okay. Textual evaluation is an art.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm giving you these simply as samples of summaries, because in the end, it becomes an issue of every single verse. There is no single manuscript that anywhere near everybody trusts. Even the Greek Orthodox scholars recognize that all these Greek Orthodox manuscripts were subject to the same problems everybody else is. And remember, you see, we have, in addition to all of this issue of the manuscript itself, these voluminous quotes of the church fathers through the first 3 centuries, especially the 2nd through the 3rd century and into the 5th century, where they are clearly reflecting a verse almost word for word. And then we have all of these translations made in the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th century. Well, if the translation doesn't have this whole long phrase in it, then there's a pretty good chance it wasn't there when they were translated. So it doesn't make any difference how many manuscripts you have with this phrase in there. If you've got 4 ancient translations made in the 4th or the 5th century, and none of them have this phrase in there, it doesn't make any difference how many Greek manuscripts have it in there. It wasn't in there in the 4th and the 5th century when they translate. Or like the one we mentioned in the Lord's Prayer, thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. The Lord's Prayer is quoted several times by these fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. None of them have that phrase in it. So again, wouldn't make any difference how many Greek manuscripts you had that have it in there. These guys didn't know it. So you're having to weigh this whole range of literature. On every single passage, where you have a difference. Now, again, remember, in the vast majority of cases, we're talking about spelling, we're talking about prepositions, we're talking about word order, we're talking about synonyms. We're not talking about substantive material, with a couple of exceptions. How much time did I leave us? Okay.
But how many exceptions do you need?
There are two.
And so they go through all of this.
Yeah,
And the Army.
yeah.
But some churches, you know, they always will tell you which Bible
Yeah.
they're using.
We have two long passages. We have a couple of dozen verses in addition, where a whole verse is in question in one, and we're going to look at those. We're going to look at the two major ones tonight, just to give you an introduction. Okay. The first one, if you have your Bible, you need to, and you have a printout for it as well. One on Mark, and it looks like this. Starts out with NIV 16:8. All these were in order when I gave them to you.
So it'll read different if I have a different,
Yes, and what I'm going to show you here is this one starts NIV 16:8. It's a 4-page document. Okay. In some Bibles, the NIV Bible translation, you will find at the end of 16:8, where the passage reads, "Trembling and bewildered, the women left the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." And the NIV then has a footnote that says, and these footnotes will vary not just by translation, they will vary by printing, by who the printer is. This one I picked has the earliest manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16:9 through 20. And then they quote the whole passage, which they include in the text after this footnote, after this note that they put in. Another edition of the NIV has some manuscripts have the following ending between verses 8 and 9. And one manuscript has it after 8 without 9 through 20. And that manuscript reads, "And they quickly reported all these instructions to those around Peter. And after this, Jesus also sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation." That's what the NIV says. The American Standard Version tells us the two oldest Greek manuscripts and some authorities omit verses 9 to the end. And then some other authorities have a different ending. Two, the Vatican and Sinai, and an old Syriac, in fact, lack it. But Alexandria, Ephraim, and Beza, see, they even name them with a number of early uncials, also late uncials and cursives, 5 Old Latins, the Vulgate, the Old Syriac, the Peshitta, and other versions have this ending. So it's there in a whole lot of old stuff, but it's missing from some. And an explicit statement of Irenaeus in 150 shows both this ending and the idea that Mark is the one who wrote it. Then we have the footnote in the New American Standard, which is a revision of the American Standard. This one was done in 1995. And they simply tell you a few late manuscripts and versions contain this paragraph 9 through 20, usually after verse 8, although few have it at the ending of this second version, which shows up. And then they quote this version that we saw earlier. This is the discussion in the New Revised Standard Version. They footnoted. The New American Bible has an extensive footnote. This is a Catholic Bible. The longer ending, 9 through 20, they print. The shorter ending, and they reported all these instructions to Peter, and afterwards Jesus sent them out. So they have both of them in the text, up in the text. And then they have this footnote. And they tell you it's missing. It was judged by the fathers to be legitimate. And they have this extensive footnote. Then they even mention this one that has a totally different ending that nobody else has mentioned. And then the NET Bible, the NET Bible, the New English Translation, which is an online version. They finally started printing it. But this is an online version, and it's a living translation. The scholars who contribute to this actively work on this all the time. So it's always changing. And one of the nice things about it is there are extensive footnotes, both on text and translation. And then there's a third category. So this is a great one to use. It's online. You can see it on, you can get it, you can download the connection on your own computer and have it by itself, but they also have it now in Bible Gateway with all these footnotes. And so they have all of these footnotes discussing it. What's going on here? How would you explain all these differences? How are you going to evaluate them? And they give you a lot of the internal stuff. The fact that 9 through 20 has vocabulary and stuff that's not found in any of the rest of Mark. So it almost sounds like, if you know Greek well, that it's written by somebody else. And so there are extensive footnotes here to talk about this. And then finally, they mention, oops, I went by it. Where did it go? This textual commentary of the Greek New Testament. Unless you become a serious student of Scripture, you don't need to worry about it. But if you're serious about wrestling with these issues, this is a little book. It's based on the Greek text, but you can ignore that because the chapter and verse number is there. And it's done in Bible order, chapter, verse. So you can find any verse where there's a question. And he has an elaborate discussion about this ending problem with the book of Mark. And he talks about the various manuscripts, about the various internal things. He talks about the church fathers. He gives some explanation for what they value as how these various things got done. And their conclusion is that Mark probably didn't write this in the first edition of his book. Probably got added by somebody else very early, probably by the 2nd century at least, because Irenaeus knows it in the middle of the 2nd century in 150. But now you go back and look at the text, 9 through 20. If it wasn't there, what do you lose? It's not already in Matthew or Luke or John. Is there anything in 9 through 20? And of course, the reality is there is, because you don't get the snake biting being saved by.
So that, in a way, has caused a new, like, belief, right?
Of course. And then, of course, the reality is those people who practice that totally misunderstand the passage. They're misapplying the passage. But you really don't even lose that, because you still have the story of in Acts of Paul, who's bitten by a snake, is poisonous, and he doesn't die. So the idea that God can, when he chooses to do that, you don't even lose that specific thing if you don't have that passage. For the charismatics, you have the slightly stronger than some other passages might be reference to those who believe will be able to do these. And that's often referred to them because that's inclusive and it's permanent and it's universal. But that's only a little bit more plain than what you get in the book of Acts. I mean, there's no difficulty in reading that into Acts 2:38, and you receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is what we have and what we've done this day. And so you would, if you got the Spirit, you would expect to get the Spirit like we who are here today doing the things we're doing, and you'd expect to do the things we're doing. So again, you don't really lose anything. No doctrine is suddenly twisted, changed, modified if you don't have that passage. And it's clearly a part of the biblical tradition from very, very early. So now you have that same issue that an Old Testament scholar of considerable note raised about the Old Testament. When he started his career 50 years ago, the big thing in Old Testament scholarship was how the Old Testament is a composite of a bunch of stuff. And how there was this great tradition and history behind all of these pieces, and how you really needed to separate them all out and study them independently. And he came along and said, no, you still have to deal with the fact that what we have is the text in front of us. We don't have the pieces. We have a coherent text, a canon text. We don't have a single book even. We have a whole collection of books that we have to consider in their entirety. So we can't grab a verse here and lift it up and use it however we want to, however that might disregard, even contradict and oppose the message of the whole canon. You can't take this stuff as pieces. It's in a canon. And by our faith, you see, we believe the canon is the product of God. So even if this didn't happen to be there in the first edition of Mark, God seems to have gotten it in there pretty early. And so if you're going to study that passage specifically, then you need to weigh these two factors. Okay, that's the end of Mark. The only other passage of any length, more than a verse, verse and a half, anywhere in the New Testament is this one in John. And for that, we have this one. Concerning the story of the adulteress in the 8th chapter of John. And if you go there, you'll find, let me blow this up, you'll find the same kind of textual version notes. The American Standard, way back in 1901, had the marginal note. Most of the ancient authorities, i.e. that they mean manuscripts, they could include in that the church fathers, quotes, omit John 5:7-53 through 8:11. And those which contain it have it in various other places. The Revised Standard, the New American Standard of 63, the New King James Version, the New King James Version even notes that it's not in the original text. They are present in 900 manuscripts, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They may have been late manuscripts.
Brother Platt, when they say it's not present in the original manuscript, do we know what that original manuscript is that they're referring to, or no?
No, we don't have any idea what the original was. We don't know anything more than the 3rd century, the 200s. We've got a scrap from the 150s, but it's not this it's not this passage, so we can't use it. We've got some early papyri, but they don't have this section in it. So we don't, we're not anywhere close to the original to know whether it was there or not. But it becomes legitimately questionable simply because even when it does show up, it doesn't show up always in this place. Now there again, you can go through, I gave you the same amount of stuff, whole bunch of people, you can read all this if you want to. They explain the various ideas. Here's Metzger's textual commentary again, and his long discussion of this passage. Raymond Brown in his commentary on the Gospel of John, and it's actually 2 or 3 volume commentary. This guy is a prolific writer, and he discusses this. And you can read their discussions. And basically, it comes down to much like the book of Mark. It's clearly not there as early, 150 for Irenaeus, but it is there pretty early. And the fact that it's not in John's original version doesn't mean it's not an authentic story. Remember, John tells us a whole bunch of other things Jesus did I don't have space, time to write to. So it's entirely possible that this is an authentic story. It's also entirely possible, even likely, that John didn't include it in his edition. But again, go back and read the story. What do you lose if you didn't have it?
We wouldn't be wondering what he wrote on the sand.
Yeah, there's some little specific things. You've heard that mean joke about that, haven't you?
What's that?
Jesus wrote in the sand and stood up and said, "He that is without sin, throw the first stone." And about that time, the rock hit her. And he turns around and says, "Mother." Again, see, there's no critical point here. There's no doctrine, rises or falls on this passage. Even his willingness to forgive in the most extreme circumstances is not lost. He can do that to a thief on the cross. And we have a story of a woman who was a sinner who is clearly forgiven by Jesus, remember? She washes his feet to the consternation of those. So we have the story of a woman of questionable repute whom Jesus accepts. We have him accepting an unclean woman, bleeding, and he accepts her touch. So there again, and these are the only two passages longer than a verse or two over which there is any question at all. And so people who want to question the veracity of the Bible because all we've got are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and therefore it could be wrong here, it could be wrong there. That just doesn't hold water. We've got copies of copies on top of copies of all different kinds in several different languages, and thousands of quotes in the first several centuries that validate like 99% of the material we have. So there's just no reason to question it. Now, to lock this down, next week, we're going to go through 2 or 3 of these translations, bring the one you read most often so you can compare it to what we're seeing. And we're going to look at all of these other many places, quote, many, but I can put them on 6 or 8 sheets of paper, where there is a verse, there is a phrase, there is a name, there is a verse tense, there is a verb tense that changes the meaning a little bit. Those guys we're going to look at, obviously very briefly, because we're not going to take time to go through all of them. But I'll give you the list so you'll have it. And you can see that what you have in your Bible is on solid ground. And doesn't make any difference what the translation is, what manuscripts they chose to use. And the reality is, I don't think until recently, I think very recently, somebody I read has come up with a translation where they chose a manuscript and they translated by that manuscript. I think I saw that. I should have, when I saw it, take a note of that. I'll see if I can find it, but that's a pointless exercise because there just is no manuscript. that merits that kind of value. Now, we're doing it in the Old Testament manuscript because we only have 2 old manuscripts. And so each one of them is now being used as the basis for a Hebrew text in Hebrew of the Old Testament. Because they're the only 2 up till 1,000 that we have. Until Qumran gave us scraps and a couple of shots at Isaiah with a whole manuscript that demonstrates that the manuscript we've got hadn't changed that much. And we'll look at that when we look at the Old Testament. Because we'll do the same thing with it. Okay? I gave you all this material for your reading, for your assurance. The end result is very trustworthy. Okay. Any questions?
Thank you, Brother Platt.
I even left you a minute. No, I didn't. I get quit right. No, I'm supposed to go to 20 after, aren't I did give you a minute. Okay. See you all hopefully next week.
Thank you.
You are
All right,
welcome.
have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
And Angie's here. 3 here and 3 online.
Did you, you gave her yet?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I didn't see it.
I was just mine. I love it.
So neat, so neat.